Welcome back to the deep dive. Looks like we're really going to dig deep into the philosophy of education today.
Yep, philosophy of education. We're tackling Nell Nodding's book, Philosophy of Education.
That's right, Philosophy of Education
Yeah.
by Nell Noddings. It's going to be great to dive into this with you.
Really exciting stuff.
Really is. Unpack some of these juicy ideas, help you connect the dots between what these philosophers were saying and what's going on in education today.
Absolutely. Tracing those lines of thought from those early thinkers to modern debates.
Yeah. So before we get too deep into all of that, I'm curious, what does Noddings even mean by philosophy of education?
Right.
I mean, we're not exactly teaching kids to, be philosophers.
Right. No, not exactly. It's, it's less about creating these grand theories and more about putting them to the test.
Okay.
Noddings really emphasizes that it's about this rigorous analysis.
Okay.
Looking at the ideas, the assumptions, even the language that we use when we're talking about education. So less of a how-to manual, more like we're going to, give our educational beliefs a good hard workout.
Yeah. I like that, pushing ourselves to really examine why we believe what we believe about education.
Yeah.
And how those beliefs actually translate into practice in the classroom.
Love it. So where does Nodding start this philosophical workout?
Oh.
Well, she kicks things off with one of the most famous question askers of all time.
Okay.
Socrates.
Oh, yeah. The guy who got into all sorts of trouble for asking those tough questions and challenging authority.
Exactly. I mean, you remember learning about the Socratic method? Leading students to knowledge through a series of questions?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, for sure. I actually remember using that in teaching.
Yeah.
And kind of got in trouble a few times.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Too much questioning.
That's interesting. It's like Noddings uses Socrates as a sort of cautionary tale.
Okay.
Right. Teachers encouraging students to question everything, especially authority.
Yeah.
They might face a little bit of pushback.
Yeah. I mean, that's still true today, isn't it? Yeah. Teachers who challenge the norms, they definitely can ruffle some feathers.
Oh, absolutely. And I think that's what Noddings is getting at, those uncomfortable questions.
Yeah.
They're really at the heart of philosophy, even if it gets you into a little bit of hot water.
Love that. Now, after Socrates, Noddings moves on to his student Plato, right?
Yeah.
And I have to admit, when I think of Plato, I mostly think about, those late-night study sessions in college.
Oh, yeah.
Trying to cram for exams in the library.
The dreaded Plato exams.
But Noddings points out that Plato's Republic is actually a blueprint for an ideal education system.
It is, a whole blueprint.
Yeah.
And it's amazing how many of his ideas are still relevant today. Like his belief in tailoring education to individual capacities.
Oh, wow. So that's not a new idea at all.
Not at all. It goes all the way back to ancient Greece.
Wow.
Yeah. But of course, there were some aspects of Plato's vision that haven't aged quite as well.
Like what?
Well, he had this pretty rigid idea that people fell into these distinct categories based on their abilities.
That sounds a little bit like tracking, which is a pretty controversial topic in education today.
Yeah, exactly. And that's where the philosophy of education can really help us unpack those complex issues.
Yeah.
Consider the potential consequences of different approaches.
For sure. Okay. So after Plato, we have Aristotle, another ancient Greek philosopher whose ideas are still super influential today.
Definitely.
I remember studying Aristotle mostly for his ideas about logic, but Noddings really focuses on his thoughts on moral development.
Right.
Which I think is super relevant today.
It is. Aristotle was really big on character education.
Okay.
Training young people in virtuous behavior.
So basically teaching kids to be good people.
Exactly. And, there's a real resurgence of that today with this renewed focus on social emotional learning.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It seems like we'd want to, teach kids to be good people. But how do we do that without imposing our own values on them? It seems like a fine line between character education and indoctrination.
That's a really important point, and it's something that Noddings grapples with throughout the book. How do we cultivate critical thinking, ethical reasoning, while still respecting students' individuality and autonomy?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'm really starting to see how the philosophy of education, it's not just about abstract ideas.
Right.
It has real-world implications for how we approach teaching.
It absolutely does. Now, moving on from ancient Greece, Noddings takes us to Jean-Jacques Rousseau, a hugely influential figure who had some pretty radical ideas about education.
Oh, yeah, Rousseau. He was all about the natural state of humans.
Yeah.
Believed that society corrupts us.
Yeah.
I remember learning about his book, Emile.
Yes.
Where he lays out his vision for an education that's guided by nature and a child's natural development.
That's right. Rousseau was a big proponent of this idea of tailoring education to a child's developmental readiness, which is still very much alive today in the concept of developmentally appropriate practices.
Yeah. So we have Rousseau to thank for the idea that we shouldn't be pushing kids to learn things before they're ready.
Pretty much. I mean, that seems like common sense now.
Right.
But it was groundbreaking back then.
Yeah, I could see that.
Yeah.
But, of course, Rousseau was a product of his time and some of his views, particularly about girls' education.
Oh, yeah.
Let's just say they haven't aged well.
Yeah. He definitely had some ideas about women that we wouldn't necessarily agree with today.
Right. Noddings doesn't shy away from pointing out those limitations. But she also highlights another fascinating figure who built on some of Rousseau's ideas. Johann Heinrich Pestalozzi.
Yes, Pestalozzi. He was really a champion for educational equity. He believed that even children from poor backgrounds, given the right support and a nurturing learning environment, could thrive and learn.
It's amazing to see someone advocating for those ideas centuries ago.
I know, right?
It's also a bit disheartening that even 200 years later, we're still struggling with the issue of educational inequity.
It's true. Pestalozzi's work is a reminder that access to quality education, it's still a major challenge. And it raises those questions about how we can create truly equitable learning opportunities for all students.
Yeah, it definitely does. You know, we're already starting to see some recurring themes here. The tension between individual needs and societal expectations. The role of the teacher as a facilitator or a challenger.
Right.
And this question of what knowledge is most valuable.
Absolutely. And those themes are going to keep weaving their way through our exploration of the philosophy of education.
Okay.
But before we delve into some of the other major schools of thought, like analytic philosophy and existentialism, I think it's time for a quick break.
Sounds good to me.
We'll be back in a few minutes to continue our deep dive into philosophy education.
See you on the other side.
It's fascinating how those ideas from centuries ago are still so relevant to the challenges we face in education today.
They really are. It makes you realize these conversations about education, they're not really new at all. You know, they're part of a much longer and richer history.
Absolutely. A much longer history.
Yeah.
And that brings us to another important figure, John Dewey.
Oh, yeah, Dewey.
A real pioneer in the early 20th century.
Yeah, I remember learning about his emphasis on experience and democracy in education. Believed that learning should be hands-on relevant to students' lives.
Exactly. Dewey wasn't about ditching those traditional subjects altogether, though.
Okay.
He still saw value in math history and so on, but he believed they could be taught in a way that really engaged students' natural curiosity.
Okay, so instead of just, memorizing facts and formulas, students would be actively exploring and experimenting.
Exactly. More engaging for sure. He called for creating these problematic situations where students would encounter real-world challenges and have to work together to find solutions.
I love that. It's all about connecting learning to the real world.
It is.
Making it meaningful for students.
And that connects to another key part of Dewey's philosophy, his belief in democracy.
Okay.
He saw education as this essential tool for preparing students to be active, engaged citizens.
So it's not just about individual growth. It's about preparing students to participate in a democratic society. I'm starting to see how all of these different philosophical perspectives connect and build on each other.
They do, and that's what's so fascinating about studying this. It's not about finding the one right answer.
Right.
It's about exploring all these different perspectives, deepening our understanding.
For sure. So we've talked about some pretty big names in philosophy. And I have to admit, sometimes it feels a little overwhelming.
Yeah.
Like, how do we make sense of all these ideas, apply them to, real classrooms?
That's a great question. And it's something Noddings addresses by exploring all these different branches of philosophy and how they shed light on specific aspects of education. For example, she talks about analytic philosophy.
Analytic philosophy. That sounds intense. Is that where we get into like all the really technical, logical stuff?
It can be pretty technical, but it's not just about logic. It's really about getting clear on our concepts and the language we use.
Right.
Think of it this way. Before you can have a really productive conversation about anything, you need to make sure everyone's speaking the same language.
Right.
Using the same terms in the same way.
So it's like defining our terms, making sure we're all on the same page before we jump into those big philosophical debates.
Exactly. Analytic philosophers might analyze concepts like teaching, learning, or indoctrination. Break them down. Examine their different components. Asking questions like, what are the necessary and sufficient conditions for something to count as teaching?
Mm.
Or how do we distinguish between teaching and indoctrination?
That's interesting. It's like taking those everyday words we use in education, putting them under a microscope to really understand what they mean.
And while it might seem abstract at times, this kind of rigorous analysis can actually help us avoid those misunderstandings and develop those more effective educational practices.
So even those more technical branches of philosophy can have practical implications.
They absolutely can. Now, philosophy isn't all about analysis and logic, though. Noddings explores schools of thought that delve into those bigger questions, too.
You mean like those existential questions?
Yeah, like the meaning of life, the purpose of education.
Oh, you mean existentialism? I have to admit my image of existentialism is mostly, black turtlenecks, smoky cafes, and lots of brooding.
Right. The black turtlenecks and cafes are optional.
Yeah.
But existentialism grapples with those big questions. Freedom, choice, creating meaning.
Okay, so how does all of that apply to education?
Well, existentialism in education, it's more about recognizing students' freedom and agency, their ability to make choices, create their own paths.
So it's about empowering students to take ownership of their learning.
Exactly. Thinkers like Sartre and Buber, they emphasized authentic relationships and self-discovery. They believe education should help students become more self-aware, connect with their own values and aspirations.
I love that. It's about more than just acquiring knowledge. It's about helping students develop into fully realized human beings.
It is. And that brings us to another really important branch of philosophy that Noddings explores. Critical theory. This is where we start looking at the bigger picture. How education functions within society. How it can perpetuate or even challenge those existing power structures.
Critical theory. That sounds a bit intimidating. What exactly does it mean?
It might sound intimidating, but really it's about asking critical questions about the status quo. Critical theory examines how power operates in society and shapes our experiences, including our educational experiences. It asks questions like, who benefits from the current system? Whose voices are silenced or marginalized? How can we create a more just and equitable system for all learners?
So it's about looking beyond the individual student, considering the broader social and political context of education?
Exactly. Critical theorists might analyze things like curriculum pedagogy or even school funding policies to see how they reflect or reinforce existing power dynamics.
I can see how that would be important for understanding things like, racial disparities in education, the impact of poverty on students' access to quality education.
Exactly. Critical theory helps us see how education can be both a tool for liberation and a means of social control. It challenges us to examine our own assumptions and biases and to work towards creating a more equitable and just system for all students.
It sounds like critical theory is really pushing us to think critically about the role of education in society and how we can use it to create positive change.
It is. And that leads us to another branch of philosophy that Noddings explores, one that challenges those traditional notions of knowledge and truth, postmodernism.
Postmodernism. Now, that's one I've heard a lot about, but I'm not sure I fully understand it. Isn't it all about, deconstructing everything, saying there's no such thing as objective truth?
Well, it's a bit more nuanced than that. Postmodernism doesn't necessarily deny that truth exists. But it questions the idea that there's one single objective truth that everyone can access in the same way. Instead, postmodernists, they emphasize perspective context, the ways that power shapes our understanding of the world.
So it's not about saying anything goes or that all truths are equal. It's more about recognizing that our understanding of truth is always shaped by our own experiences and the social and cultural context that we live in.
Exactly. And this has big implications for education. Postmodernism challenges us to be more critical of those grand narratives and universal truths that we often just take for granted. It encourages us to consider multiple perspectives, be open to different ways of knowing, and recognize that knowledge itself is always evolving.
That's a really different way of thinking about education. It's not just about imparting a fixed body of knowledge. It's about helping students develop those critical thinking skills. Openness to different perspectives that they need to navigate a complex and ever-changing world.
It is. And that brings us to some more specific areas of philosophy that have direct relevance to what we do in the classroom. Noddings delves into logic and critical thinking. Those are essential skills for any learner.
Yeah, those are definitely buzzwords in education these days. Everyone's talking about teaching kids to think critically.
Right.
But I'm not always sure what that means in practice. Is it just about teaching them formal logic, argumentation skills?
Well, there's a big debate about that. Some philosophers and educators, they advocate for that more formal approach.
Okay.
Focusing on identifying logical fallacies, constructing valid arguments, using deductive reasoning.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
But I can also see how that might feel a bit dry and disconnected from students' everyday experiences.
Yeah, that's a valid concern. And that's why many educators favor a more informal approach.
Okay.
One that embeds those skills in real-world contexts and problem solving.
So instead of just teaching those abstract logic rules, you'd have students grappling with real-world dilemmas, thinking critically about different solutions.
It might involve analyzing current events, debating ethical issues, or even designing solutions to community problems.
I love that. That sounds a lot more engaging and relevant to students' lives. It's about helping them see how critical thinking can make a difference in the world.
It is, and that connects to another area of philosophy. Noddings explores epistemology.
Epistemology. That sounds deep. What kinds of questions does that address?
Epistemology. It delves into questions like, what does it mean to know something? How do we acquire knowledge? What are the different ways of knowing? And what are the limits of human knowledge?
Those are some big questions. Seems like the answers would have huge implications for education.
They do. Different epistemological perspectives lead to different approaches to teaching.
Okay.
For example, there are foundationalists. They believe knowledge is built upon a foundation of certain indubitable truths. These truths might be based on reason logic or even divine revelation.
So foundationalists would say there are some things we can know for absolute certain, and those truths should form the basis of our education.
Exactly. On the other hand, you have non-foundationalists.
Okay.
They argue that knowledge is more fluid, contextual, even subjective.
Interesting.
They might emphasize experience interpretation,
Okay.
the social construction of knowledge.
So non-foundationalists might be more likely to embrace those diverse perspectives, encourage students to question those absolute truths.
They might. And that highlights another crucial area of philosophy Noddings explores: ethics and moral education. How do we teach students to be good people? What values should we instill? How do we equip them to make ethical decisions?
Those are huge questions. I remember, in my schooling, moral education was mostly about memorizing rules,
right?
Following authority figures. Seems like there's a lot more to it than that.
There is. Different ethical theories offer different frameworks. For example, you have Kantianism, which emphasizes universal moral principles and duty. And then there's utilitarianism, which focuses on maximizing happiness, minimizing suffering.
So Kantianism seems to be more about following the rules, whereas utilitarianism is about considering the consequences.
Exactly. And then there's virtue ethics, which goes all the way back to Aristotle. Emphasizes developing good character traits like honesty, compassion, courage.
Okay.
Noddings herself is a proponent of care ethics.
Care ethics? What's that?
Care ethics focuses on relationships, empathy, responsiveness to the needs of others. So it's less about following those abstract rules, more about cultivating the qualities that allow us to connect with others and care for them.
I like that. Seems like a really important foundation for moral education.
It does. And all of these ethical theories have implications for how we approach teaching.
Yeah, for sure.
Do we focus on teaching students to follow the rules, to think about the consequences, or to cultivate certain virtues? Or do we take a more holistic approach?
It sounds like there's no one right answer.
There isn't.
It's about considering those different frameworks and finding what resonates with our own values.
Exactly. And that brings us back to the importance of the philosophy of education. It's about wrestling with these complex questions, engaging in thoughtful dialogue, constantly reflecting on our own beliefs and practices.
It's clear that Nodding sees philosophy of education as more than just an academic exercise. It's about connecting those big ideas to the real-world challenges of teaching.
Absolutely.
And using them to create more meaningful and equitable learning experience.
Exactly. And that's what makes this exploration so valuable.
Yeah.
It's not just about understanding what those philosophers said in the past.
Right.
It's about using their ideas to inform our present, shape a better future for education.
I love that. This has been such an insightful conversation.
It has.
I feel like I have a much deeper understanding now.
Me too. And we've only scratched the surface. There's so much more to explore in Nodding's work.
Right.
And in the field of philosophy of education.
For sure. I'm definitely excited to keep learning and thinking about these ideas.
Me too. But I think it's time to move on to the final part of our deep dive.
Okay. Let's do it. And we're back, ready to wrap up our deep dive into philosophy of education.
Yeah, it's been quite a journey, tracing these ideas all the way from ancient Greece to today.
It really has. And it's amazing how those philosophical conversations from centuries ago are still shaping how we think about education.
They really are. And as we wrap up this exploration, I think it's important to kind of step back.
Okay.
And think about what this all means.
Yeah.
For us as educators, as learners.
So you mean, how do we take all of these philosophical insights and actually apply them to our own classrooms, to our own lives?
Exactly. Noddings doesn't just leave us with a bunch of abstract theories. She challenges us to really think critically about how those theories can inform our practice.
Right.
Help us create those more meaningful and effective learning experiences.
So it's not just about understanding the history of philosophy.
Right.
It's about using that understanding to make a real difference.
Yeah, to make a difference in the lives of students.
And I think one of the biggest takeaways from Nodding's work is that education is about so much more than just transmitting knowledge.
It is. It's about fostering those intellectual, moral, and social skills that help students become well-rounded individuals.
Right.
Active, engaged citizens.
Exactly. And that means creating those learning environments that are intellectually stimulating, ethically challenging, and socially connected. It's about nurturing the whole person.
The whole person, not just filling their heads with facts.
Noddings also highlights the importance of relationships in education.
Yeah.
Between teachers and students and among students.
Absolutely. Creating that genuine learning community.
Right.
Where everyone feels respected, valued, supported. And that takes more than just delivering content from the teacher.
Yeah.
It's about cultivating those caring, responsive relationships.
I can see how that sense of connection, that sense of belonging,
can
make a huge difference in a student's experience.
Yeah.
It creates that space where they feel safe to take risks, to ask questions.
To really dive into those challenging ideas.
Exactly. And another key takeaway for me is that there's no one-size-fits-all approach to education.
There isn't. There's no single right way to teach or to learn.
So different philosophical approaches offer different perspectives.
They do.
And different students thrive in different environments.
Absolutely. What works for one student might not work for another.
So it's about finding what resonates most with our own beliefs as educators.
Yeah.
And then adapting to meet the individual needs of our students.
Exactly. Requires us to be open to new ideas, to question our assumptions, and to be willing to experiment.
And to recognize that education is complex. It's messy.
Oh, it is.
There are no easy answers.
Yeah.
What works in one context might not work in another.
That's why that ongoing reflection, that dialogue is so important.
It is.
We need to be constantly asking ourselves, what are our goals? What values are we promoting? How can we create those experiences that are meaningful and effective?
It sounds like the philosophy of education.
Yeah.
It's really a lifelong journey.
It is.
For both teachers and for students.
A journey of inquiry and growth. And that's what's so exciting about it. There's always more to learn, more to explore.
Absolutely. Well, we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive.
We have, from Socrates to postmodernism.
From ancient Greece to modern classrooms.
Exploring those fundamental questions about knowledge, the purpose of education, the role of the teacher.
And while we might not have all the answers, I think we've gained a much deeper understanding of just how complex all of this is.
I agree. And I hope this deep dive has sparked some new ideas for you.
Me too.
Inspired you to keep exploring these questions.
It's definitely been a rewarding journey, and I'm excited to see where these ideas lead us.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
We'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.